Hey, I want to share a little bit on the return of Christ. And specifically in these videos, I'm going to talk about the timing of his return. And because if you're like me, I started somewhere kind of thinking that Jesus was going to return before a crisis hits the earth, before, the events of the book of Revelation or tribulation. But then as I began to study scripture, I began to realize that Jesus is actually returning after those 7 years, after tribulation. And we're going to go through the crisis and really, it will purify us, but also help others to come and to know Christ and come to salvation in that hour. And so this is actually something that I hear a lot of conversations and people kind of bouncing back and forth. I want to give the scriptural references because before I just took what people were saying and kind of grabbed that as my own, and it sounded nice. Not to go through the tribulation sounds like a great idea. But then when I started to look at the scripture, my view and even my heart began to shift concerning crisis, concerning the return of Christ and tribulation. And now I find myself very confident that we are going through the tribulation. And this, if we don't understand this, it can be a massive pastoral crisis, because you look at people that aren't prepared to go through trials and tribulations to the extent of the book of Revelation. And many people, as Matthew 24 said, will become offended because of the increase of wickedness. And so as I go through this, I'm going to try to break these up in small bits and just look at a scripture and kind of show where the placement of Jesus's return is in that scripture. Now, one of the ideas that we do have out there in Matthew 24 is that we don't know the time of his return. And this is absolutely true. We don't know the hour. And he says in Matthew 24, verse 36, but about the day or the hour, no one knows. Not even the angels in heaven or the Son, but only the Father. And we kind of leave that verse there to say, hey, you know what? We don't really have to study this. He's just going to show up, at some point. But if we look at the context of just that verse, and we'll do this through several verses, but right before that, he's calling us to learn this lesson from a fig tree. As soon as its twigs get tender and its leaves come out, you know that the summer is near. Even so, when you see all these things, you know that it is near, right at the door. And he goes, truly, I tell you, this generation will certainly not pass away until all of these things have happened. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. And so what he says is he's actually calling us to learn the season. Now, we won't know the day or hour, but the season is critical, and he takes Matthew 24 to show us the signs. He talks about Daniel and what he shared, that we would understand when the Antichrist comes, what we should do and how to respond. He calls us not to be deceived in that hour, not to be troubled by some of the increase of wickedness and darkness and even the persecution that would come. And he's laying this out in Matthew 24 to the point where he said, he likens it to birth pains. And what the birth pains do is it tells you that the season is shifting, right? The baby is coming, and get ready. Now, birth pains are painful. And I know that as we lead up to Jesus's return and the events that come, it will be painful. But when we understand that these pains are unto the coming of Jesus, we then can get excited for the promise, right? For the baby. And we can respond in that hour rightly, that we're prepared to receive the life that's coming. In the same way in a natural birth, when a mom begins to have birth pains, she lives dramatically different. She gets in a position, in a place where she can actually take and receive the baby, the promise, the life that's coming. In the same way, as we are seeing the birth pains in the nations right now, it's not a time to say, hey, nobody knows the day or hour. It's a time to say, look at what Jesus is doing. He's calling us to prepare to go through some of this trouble and the crisis in the nations, that we would receive Jesus, our great promise. And in that tribulation, in that crisis, rather than shrinking back, we would grow in excitement, and we would also grab others in that time, that we would see a revival. And so, hey, again, I want to try to keep these fairly short with less than 10 minutes. But I want to encourage you, grab a hold of these as we look at the verses, and we'll start in Matthew 24, look at some of those verses and break them down so that you're not just taking somebody's opinion or idea, but we're actually looking at the verses that show when Jesus would return, that we would be ready for that. We would receive everything that he wants us to receive in that hour. And so I'm greatly encouraged by the reality that we're leading generations into the return of Christ. Now, that's with I'm very sober in that hour too, understanding that we are in the midst of crisis, a falling away, as Matthew 24 said, a great deception. And so we just pastorally want to grab a hold of and anchor ourselves in truth, that we don't set up a whole generation to miss what God is doing in our hour, in this season, but we can partner with him, not believing in a reality of that Jesus just escapes us from pain or tribulation. And I want to say this too. There is so many good, solid teachings that embrace a pre-tribulation. This is not a salvation issue. But nevertheless, I believe that we need to grab a hold of the scripture to know our views and not just somebody's opinion. So, hey, I hope you enjoy this. I hope it helps, and look forward to some of these teachings to come.